Hey there, it's been a surprising week in the politics of Israel and Palestine. Today I'm not going to do a deep dive into the Sheikh Jarrah controversy. The issues surrounding the evictions from that Palestinian neighborhood in Jerusalem are complicated, and I'm sure I'm not even pronouncing the name of the neighborhood correctly. No, what I want to talk about today is how surprising it is that we're talking about Sheikh Jarrah at all. 3 years ago, when Israeli snipers were killing literally dozens of mostly unarmed protesters at the Gaza border, I was bothered enough to make a video about it. But I am fundamentally pretty cowardly when it comes to Israel and Palestine, so to talk about how angry the killings made me, I made a very careful analogy to my personal experience of mass protest in Turkey and spoke in pretty mealy-mouthed ways about the tragic loss of life. I don't feel that fear so much anymore, and it seems like nobody else does either. Over the past couple days, I've seen news reports on both CBS and MSNBC that talk about these issues almost completely without bringing up the standard IPAC talking points. If I were a supporter of Israeli occupation, I'd be feeling whiplash right about now. Heck, I've been expecting this development for quite some time, and even I am surprised by how quickly it's happening. It's legitimately shocking that US media has spent a couple days diving into a real estate dispute in Jerusalem that really only affects about 6 households. Even after the Hamas morons in Gaza have started throwing rockets into the mix, US media is still focused on this real estate dispute. Traditionally, rockets from Gaza are kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free card for Israeli occupation, but not this time. Of course, the Israeli side has its own morons as well. No matter the justification, images of Israeli stormtroopers throwing flashbangs at people praying in the third holiest mosque in Islam are not going to win Israel any friends. But even with all the escalation on the streets, the real estate dispute in Sheikh Jarrah has somehow remained central to the coverage, which should be super disturbing for Israel superfans. You see, what's happening in this Jerusalem neighborhood is the sort of thing that's central to the Israeli occupation in Jerusalem and the West Bank. Frankly, it's boring to learn about, which is the key to its power. The Palestinians have a legal position on the matter, and the Israelis have a legal position on the matter. Because Israel writes all the relevant laws and controls all the relevant courts, it's usually easy for Israel to sound like the rational party. Sure, violence is important too, but settlement moves forward day by day and year by year through these slow, boring, legalistic means. This process has been reported on in a very standard way in US media for decades. We'll see a poor, not particularly photogenic Palestinian on some street somewhere talking about ethnic cleansing. Maybe an old woman in a headscarf screaming and crying in Arabic. And then we'll cut back to the studio where we'll see a well-dressed, flawlessly English-speaking representative of Israel or IPAC. He'll tell us that it's such a shame what's happening to this poor woman and a real tragedy that her family left her in that position, but you know, the law is the law and there's nothing to be done. This strategy worked well for decades, but now it seems to be falling flat. 3 years ago, a literal mountain of corpses on the border with Gaza was reported on very politely in US media, if it was reported on at all. Yet now, the basic mechanics of occupation and settlement are somehow an international scandal. What happened? Well, partially it's this guy and his relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's perpetual prime minister. Netanyahu's dismissiveness and blatant disrespect for the US's first black president had already created problems, but his gross love affair with Donald Trump may have permanently turned Israel into a partisan issue in the United States. But this is an issue that's going to take another decade or two to shake out. Also, I think it's exaggerated. The United States is never going to abandon Israel. The Democratic Party is never going to abandon Israel. The dispute here is not between supporters of Israel and opponents of Israel. It is a dispute between blind, unthinking support for Israel, no matter what it does and says, and those of us who believe that the United States deserves a little more respect and deference for all the endless money and support we send to this small Middle Eastern country. The money and the support is not going to stop, at least not this century. What I think is more important is a basic strategic mistake that Trump and Netanyahu made. All wars are media wars. Until the US world system fails, Israel's standing in the world will always be more about public relations than physical security, and under Netanyahu, those public relations have gotten horrendously bad. Israel is most attractive as the underdog. It wins sympathy internationally when it is seen as being under attack. For the first 4 decades of its existence, Israel was in existential danger all the time. The Middle East was one of the Cold War's biggest flashpoints, and Israel had multiple heavily armed neighbors dedicated to its destruction, heavily backed by the Soviet Union. Sure, Israel did nasty things to Arabs back then, but these were the folks who survived the Nazis and were standing up to the commies, and a few stolen properties was nothing compared to what the United States was doing in Asia and Latin America back then. And then in a few short years, as the 1980s turned into the 1990s, everything changed. The Soviet Union basically evaporated. In the first Gulf War, the United States crushed Iraq, the country that had looked like the most threatening Arab power throughout the 1980s. All of a sudden, Israel didn't look like the heroic little guy standing up to an evil empire anymore. It looked like the heroic little guys were in Palestine. And with the United States doing a sort of global human rights house cleaning, Israel wanted to clean up its act too. Which is why we got the Oslo Accords. Israel and Palestine struck a historic peace deal in 1993 and 1995. A two-state solution was proposed, and steps were taken to begin to implement it. And who knows, if it wasn't for Osama bin Laden, maybe it would have worked. The post-9/11 rage at Muslims in the United States was very useful for Israel. For 20 years, all they had to do was use the magic word terrorism, and nobody wanted to pay much attention to what was happening in Palestine. It certainly worked on me for most of the 2000s. But things are changing. The forever wars are ending. The US military-industrial complex has shifted its focus from the Middle East to China. Muslims aren't our enemies anymore. In fact, we want to protect Muslims from the Chinese in Xinjiang. The war in Syria seems to be mostly over. Israeli bombings of the winners are the most prominent news coming out of that country now. Iran's economy is being crushed, and Israel's bombing and assassination campaigns in Iran make the mad mullahs look weak, not threatening. Israel doesn't look like a plucky little underdog fighting the good fight against Goliath. Israel looks like Goliath. The last thing Israel has that makes it look like the good guy is the undying enmity of the Arabs. The 400 million people who most closely neighbor Israel still care a lot about the Palestinians. They are very angry about the Palestinians. This means that every protest, no matter how peaceful it is, no matter how many protesters get killed, represents an existential threat against the Israeli people. Because every Palestinian throwing a rock is backed up by the anger of 400 million people. This is like permanent victory in the media wars. And that's never going to go away. I mean, unless Israel signed a whole bunch of peace deals with a bunch of Arab countries. But that's never going to happen, right? Well, that's exactly what has happened over the past 3 years. I'll be honest, I'm actually beginning to warm up to the idea of the Abraham Accords. As currently constituted, to be clear, they are fundamentally illegitimate because of the Arab governments that have signed them. They're all dictatorships of one kind or another. But in the long term, I could actually see a joint Arab-Israeli defense against the Persians and Turks maybe work out. I don't know, that could be crazy. But in the short term, the Accords are indisputably disastrous for Israel. Jordan and Egypt made peace with Israel decades ago. With 4 more countries signing up to abandon the Palestinians in 2020, the idea that Arab governments present any threat to Israel anymore is now just laughable. Saudi Arabia, the traditional paymaster of Palestinian nationalism, hasn't signed up yet, but it seems likely that it will happen just as soon as the ancient King Salman falls down a flight of stairs and MBS takes over. All wars are media wars, and with the Abraham Accords, Israel has comprehensively lost the public relations battle with Palestine. US media wants to help Israel, but it can only do so much. It's now impossible to portray Palestinian protesters as the sinister leading edge of communism or anti-Semitic petrostates. The Palestinians just look like a weak people getting beaten up on by the regional hegemon. If Israel is serious about peace with Arab peoples instead of just Arab dictators, it needs to do more for Palestine. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'd be grateful if you considered signing up for my email list as well. If the YouTube gods ever turn on me, it'll be my only way to reach you. And if you sign up, you'll also get a free PDF essay. Thanks.